Thank you for the kind introductions. So, if you think that I'm up here today with this title, you might think, hey, I'm here to talk about Stranger Things or something like that. I'm actually not. If you want to hear more about actually working on episodic, like hands-on, the technical and workflow aspects of it, one of our VFX supervisors, Seth Hill, is giving an awesome presentation tomorrow at 4 in room 510B called, I think that's this room, called Stranger Things 2, How to Outrun the TV Beast. So that's my little plug for Seth's presentation. It's really fascinating, the work that we did on Stranger Things. You might also think that I am here to talk about the social impact of binge watching on our families. This was a real photograph of my wife disapprovingly judging me for introducing my children to some form of binge watching. I think it was like SpongeBob SquarePants or something. What I'm actually here to talk about today is how episodic, and not only episodic, but just streaming content in general, and that goes for the content that the big Hollywood players are also starting to produce, is really going to affect our professional lives, right? And that goes from a business level all the way down to what all of you, if you're an artist, do day to day. First, I'm going to give a little bit of an intro to myself. Who in the room has seen me do my backstory intro? No, not a lot of people. All right, so I won't be boring many of you. I'll breeze through it though. So, and I like to tell this story because I think it really gets to the roots of why I'm so passionate about this stuff, and really where Atomic Fiction as a visual effects company came from, and why I love doing what I'm doing. And it really all started here. This is my buddy Ryan and I in my driveway at 7 years old. And we grew up watching and loving movies, Back to the Future, E.T., Star Wars, those kinds of movies. And then when we saw this film, Jurassic Park, it was a real turning point for us. I think we were 13 years old when this came out, and I was just like, shit, I need to make dinosaurs for a living. This is my calling. And so we actually went to our high school. We had a drafting program in our high school in Seattle. And he happened to have a couple of copies of 3D Studio Release 2 for DOS. And he said, well, I have no idea how to use this. The teacher just said, here's the manual. Go knock yourselves out. And he let us borrow computers during summer break and spring break. And he let us stay at school after school hours to start creating videos for high school assemblies and really being able to entertain the student body, which was just sort of our first taste at entertaining people. And that ended up getting us a job with Microsoft, which got us filmed for a documentary that was funded by none other than George Lucas, and it was narrated by the wonderful Robin Williams. If that wasn't an honor enough to be filmed for this documentary, this was in 1995, George Lucas saw it in the editing room of the documentary, and he invited us here. This is Skywalker Ranch. So, of course, we accepted his invitation quite politely as two 16-year-olds. And we had this most amazing weekend where we met George, and we had to babysit his kids for, half a day and watch a movie by Uncle Speely. We're like, oh, Spielberg, okay. It was just so surreal. I got chased by a turkey, literally got chased by a turkey on this 4,000-acre ranch. And so when Ryan and I got back from this visit, we were obviously intensely inspired. We'd seen some of the original concept artwork that only 10 people in the world had seen before for Star Wars Episode 1. So we took this as a challenge and said, well, we have to work there, right? So we created this little 5-minute long piece of that was as close to the pod race in Star Wars Episode 1 as possible. We'd seen some early previews of that, but not so close as to get us sued, with the idea that we were just going to convince George Lucas that he had no choice but to hire us to work on his pre-visualization team. So I'm going to give you a little 30-second kind of embarrassing sneak peek of this this clip that we did for George. And we sent him update tape of this every month as we were working on it in a letter saying, please hire us. Here's why we're making this video. So this is a little 30-second clip made in Windows 95 with 3D Studio Max Release 1.
Coming onto the Hamlin ball field, this sophomore needs to highlight a corner burst. But he clips the wing. Sophomores are out of the race. have been taken out.
So that was a little sneak peek at we spent a lot of nights sleeping under my desk in my mom's living room, render wrangling on that. But luckily, about 2 weeks before we graduated from high school, we got a phone call from George's producer, Rick McCallum, saying, and I'll quote him, pardon the profanity, "Stop sending us letters, quit sending us videotapes, you got the fucking job." So right after we graduated from high school, we moved down to the Bay Area, and we're part of a very small team working directly with George Lucas on like every other day basis. So it was a real privilege and a great introduction. I mean, this was film school for me. This was, 1997. So hugely awesome. And from that point, finished out episode 1, then went to work for a company called The Orphanage, which was a brilliant company. And that's where I got my first VFX supervising gigs at around, I think I started VFX suping at around 25. Then left to go to a company called Image Movers Digital, which was a Disney funded company. And visual effects supervised for Robert Zemeckis, his directed and produced movies that were motion capture movies. So it was basically animated features. And that was really interesting. We could hire anyone from anywhere in the world and had all the money in the world. But, at the Orphanage, we barely had any money, right? And we were just struggling. I again, slept under my desk multiple times there. I think I worked a 134-hour work week on Hellboy, right? So I saw how gnarly it could get. And Disney actually decided to shut down Image Movers Digital after a while. So Ryan and I, who were still working together at the time, said, well, we could go work for somebody else, or we could take these like opposite extremes of lessons and start our own thing. So that's what we did. And we started Atomic Fiction. So Atomic Fiction, we started it in 2010. So it was about 8 years ago, and now we have 285, almost 300 people between all of our offices. By far, our biggest office is here. We have almost 250 people here, and we kind of do a really broad range of visual effects. And we are privately held. We're profitable, which we're really proud of. To build a company that's profitable in the beginnings of this industry, or beginnings of when we started the company, was actually really, really challenging time in the industry, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. And we've had some really amazing collaborations, right? We've worked on, small to medium to even large size chunks of really impressive movies. And right now are, working on the next Predator movie and the next season of Stranger Things. And Welcome to Marwen is this amazing Robert Zemeckis movie that I think will blow your minds when the trailer comes out. I was working there late last night on the trailer for it, and that's going to come out in a few weeks, and it's just really incredible. So, but words are one thing. I want to show you some pretty pictures. This is the demo reel for Atomic Fiction. Thanks. Hopefully you can tell that we have a lot of fun at what we do. We kind of have a mantra internally, is just sort of show the love, right? It's like we want the love and the passion for what we do to show up on the screen. So we try to feel that every day. And where we're heading is really interesting. But I think before we talk about where the industry is going right now, I would love to just spend 2 seconds dwelling on or kind of rehashing where it is that the industry got its start from. And the origins of the industry were, to me, just like insanely inspiring. This is, when Ray Harryhausen or the, Star Wars, or, there's Phil Tippett like animating a tauntaun down there by hand. When these guys were doing this stuff, it was insanely cutting edge. Like new ground was being broken every single day in the business, right? There was always an effect that had never been achievable and was then going to be achievable because of hard work and science and technology kind of all working together. And like these images are the ones that really inspired me. The Gallimimus stampede in the original Jurassic Park just blew my mind because the camera was moving and the dinosaurs were moving, and it was just like, right? Every time you saw something like this, it was just new, right? It had never been seen before. And getting a job in the industry was really, really hard at the time because there were no educational programs to do this stuff. You kind of had to fall into it or have a connection or a friend, and then there had to be a ton of passion. But the work was so specialized and cutting edge that there were very few people that could do it and very few companies that could handle it. And so the money was actually decent if people had the business acumen to actually make the most of the opportunity. And so, fortunately back then, most of the companies were run by artists, not to make money, but people could still make it because of how specialized it all was. So that kind of takes us into what I refer to as the dark ages of the visual effects industry. Now, I've put up some bullet points of what I deem to be, thank you very much, the dark ages, and these all don't seem so dark, right? It's like, there's a lot of education out there. Anyone could start a visual effects company because the software has been sort of commercialized. Most stuff that you can do now today, you can do with most effects that a director might ask for, you can do to at least some level with off-the-shelf software. And literally every single movie that was produced last year was visual effects driven in some way. Even a movie like Get Out had a bunch of kind of trippy visual effects sequences in it. So all this stuff seems really positive. Well, the problem really is, and this is my completely unscientific supply and demand chart. This is like my gut feeling here. But, in the early days of the industry, there was very little supply, right? It was so specialized. And right in the late 90s, early 2000s, that, there were a bunch of people that said, hey, I'm being really successful at ILM, or I'm being really successful at PD. I'm going to spin out and I'm going to start my own company. Right. So and these educational programs were also coming out. So all of a sudden, there were a lot of companies out there that could do visual effects up to a certain level. Like they were pretty good. But the rate of content creation really wasn't accelerating at that same pace. And so we kind of overshot. And what we saw in the industry as a result is we have these sort of 6 major clients up top, and they only have so much work that needs to get done. And so the competition became really, really, really fierce. And unfortunately, there were a bunch of companies, some of which are listed below, 2 of which I worked at, that were fallout from the supply and demand equation not being in their favor. And of course, there were business acumen and other economic reasons, writers' strikes, all kinds of bad stuff that happened that caused these companies and more to go out of business. But it was really, really sad. And that ended up making a lot of VFX sadness, right? And, for years and years, I would go to these like conferences where there would be CEOs of visual effects companies and blah, blah, blah. And people would talk for hours on end about like how gloom and doom the industry was and how are we going to keep alive and, this, that, and the other. It was kind of sad, right? And Ryan and I decided to start Atomic Fiction at probably the worst time in all of this. And we did some kind of interesting things to help us survive in those times, like using cloud computing was one of the sort of core tenets of what we were doing. We wanted our infrastructure to scale with the amount of work that we had coming in. And that turned out to be a real saving grace for us. But man, you had to be innovative in the dark ages to really make it. Now, I think we're coming out of the dark ages and coming into the golden age. And I think it's a different golden age than the beginnings of visual effects. That was a golden age too, right? Where the sort of the creativity was sort of unbounded, and we were solving these like insanely new creative problems. This is a different golden age, right? This is an age where we are experiencing this insane growth in the amount of content that's being created, right? And this growth in content is being accelerated by not only the major studios having more avenues to get their movies in front of viewers, but it's also being accelerated by Amazon and Apple and Netflix and Hulu and HBO and all these streaming providers that are now, by 2020, like this graph is insane, by the way, right? This is the billions of dollars that they're spending. These companies are spending in actually hands-on creating content. Netflix spends another double this in terms of content acquisitions, right? So this is just what they're hands-on producing. By 2020, these companies combined, just these three, will produce more than all of traditional Hollywood combined, right? It is crazy. And the vast majority of this stuff has visual effects in it, right? So the amount of content that's being created because of these new distribution models, all Netflix has to do, and not to say all Netflix has to do, they do a really good job and they do a really complicated job, but their job is to build and retain subscriber base, right? So if there's even one show that pertains to like a particular niche of the market that causes somebody to subscribe, they've done their job, right? So they can actually deliver content to people far more cost effectively and stand a chance of profiting on it much more than the traditional Hollywood studio model. And the studios are catching on to this too, right? Disney's creating their own streaming platform. I'm sure everybody and their mother is going to have their own streaming platform at the end of the day, or partner with the big ones. And so this new model of content distribution is making an epic change in our industry and the amount of content being produced. And the other thing that's making a change in the amount of content being produced is we're kind of seeing these days of like the giant blockbuster. I mean, we're always going to have some of the giant blockbusters, but the number of them is shrinking, right? In favor of movies like Deadpool, right? And you can see why when you look at this slide. It's like, Deadpool cost $60 million to make, and it made 13x return, right? And these giant movies, even if they do really well, they'll make 2, 3, 4x return, right? So we're seeing studios, and this is absolutely true with the streaming providers, they are choosing sort of what I call a spray and pray methodology a little bit more, where they're making more content at lower price points. But like, who here thinks that like Deadpool is like a low rent VFX movie? Like, that's as much production value as pretty much any of these other ones, right? I mean, it's like crazy what was in Deadpool, right? So you can make great content sort of for these responsible budgets and just make more of it, right? So this is also contributing to the explosion in the amount of content that's out there right now. So what's that doing to supply and demand? Well, our industry can only grow as fast as it can, and our education, whether it's universities or other schools feeding into it, can only produce qualified talent as fast as it can. And the amount of content is starting to do this. Again, this is completely unscientific, but the amount of content that's out there, that the demand for the work that we're doing we're already starting to see it outstripping the supply. And, I'll quote a unnamed source at one of the major streaming providers who's been in the visual effects industry forever, who said, like, by the early 2020s, I'm worried if I booked every single visual effects vendor on the planet, there still wouldn't be capacity for the work that I have to do. It's crazy. I know I'm going to say that like 17 more times in this presentation, but it's crazy, right? And so that makes VFX happiness, right? So we're kind of out of the world of VFX sadness and into VFX happiness. And this is actually really shown in like, even as like last year, I went to FMX, a conference in Stuttgart, and they have this CEO forum there. And this is one of these forums that was like a bunch of moaning and complaining and about how hard it is. The conversation last year even made a dramatic shift to how are we going to get all this work done, right? That's happening now. And so that yields a ton of opportunity for us, right? More consistent work. The VFX team is being really respected and sort of treated as filmmakers in the process, maybe even eventually financially being treated as producers. Also there's, a lot of the complaints that we hear from people nowadays are sort of like, hey, there are unrealistic demands, but it's hard to say no because you have sort of the big major studios you need to keep happy. I think it'll also be a chance for VFX savvy filmmakers to rise to the top. The people who are going to use the tools the best are going to get the best out of the limited teams that are out there. So, and also just the increased profitability potential for the visual effects companies out there, right? Where, for everyone from the people who run and own the companies down to the people who are just getting their first internship chance in the industry, visual effects companies being healthy and profitable is a really good thing. I hear a lot of people, especially sort of back towards the tail end of the dark ages, that would lament when a visual effects company made money on a movie, right? And it's like, that is bad for the ecosystem. That is bad for the artists. It's bad for everyone, right? We want these companies, all of them, to make money so that they can treat their people better and make their work more efficient, invest in the future rather than be reactive to the now, right? It's really important. And speaking of things that are important, there are dangers that abound in this golden age, right? For one, the companies are, because of the actual distribution models, and like I'll use Netflix as an example because they are really smart. They're really, 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 really smart. And they're using analytics to figure out like who's watching my content and where, and like they're optimizing what kind of content they're producing and delivering to customers based on what's successful and what's not. So they're collecting all kinds of data and doing all kinds of smart stuff with it, machine learning and all that kind of stuff. And what they're also doing with visual effects companies is they're saying like, hey, tell us when you have capacity and like give us an idea and like let's figure out like, how can we work together better? And as a visual effects company, it's just like, oh my God, hallelujah. A client is coming to us and asking us for information rather than us having to like try to force it down their throat in a sales process. This is amazing, right? And it is amazing. But the potential pitfall of this is that our clients could end up knowing as much, if not more, about our businesses than we do, right? And so we have to be really attentive and really smart when it comes to how much data we share with the people who are these really, really smart folk on the client side, but also more than being protectionist. Really, I think it's about understanding ourselves better and becoming more efficient. Right. Also, there's sort of a potential artist happiness impact, right? I hear people all the time being a lot more motivated by the content that they're working on and the sort of the creative virtues of it than anything monetary, right? And that's why we're all artists, right? That makes a lot of sense. And so we actually ran. And this is today, right? We ran a short kind of informal survey, and the response I got back was actually really, really striking. That when we asked people, would they rather work on film or episodic if they had to choose one, 84% of them said film. And, I think that this ratio is going to change as episodic content production matures. But right now, there's only one episodic producer out there that really, really has it down to being a well-oiled machine. And even they're kind of like trying to find their footing, right? And that's Netflix, right? They're amazing to work for. But, I think that artists are still like, what we're seeing is that they're still kind of trepidatious about, what kind of content they're working on. So this is something that I think we have to be really mindful of as we move into this golden age. And of the things that we heard the respondent group in this survey say that they like, that the stuff in green is stuff that they said was a pro and the stuff in red was a con. It was really interesting to kind of see this stuff where, for example, in traditional film, the longer timelines, meaning, hey, I have more time to work on the shot, was both a pro and a con, right? It's like, I hate being stuck on a shot for 3 months, but man, I love having 3 months to make that shot look beautiful, right? And so, I think that there's no specific message in any of this stuff up here, but the fact of the matter is that there are pros and cons with all the different kinds of work. And I think that as the streaming content providers really mature in their VFX approach, the balance between film and episodic will sort of come a little bit more to an equilibrium. And things like, hey, Stranger Things comes out and now your mom can go watch the whole thing without leaving her home. That's a big attraction to some artists, right? So I think that there will be sort of a little bit of an adjustment period as we kind of settle into this new golden age. And I think another one of the dangers is like people kind of becoming jaded with the early stages of this industry, right? Of this sort of emergent part of the industry. This particular artist said, oh, look, another deadline tomorrow, and then again tomorrow, right? That's the sort of the cadence of episodic. And you want the best quality, but no time. What do you mean? You can't do a 4K monster eating unicorn in a week? Well, I guess we'll go to Joe Blow's company in his basement, right? And so there's a lot of like jadedness in this, but it's all based in sort of the truth of that person's experience, right? And I think that there are going to be smaller shops that can do specialized work for a very low price point that sort of emerge out of this world. There's going to need to be those people. There's going to be so much content to get done. Joe Blow's company in his basement is going to become a really important part of the ecosystem. But also, I think that like a lot of this stuff is just growing pains. And I think that we need to like really sort of internalize that, the studio system the traditional studio system has had 100 years to mature, right? This streaming content and streaming provider ecosystem is just a few years old, right? So I think that we need to kind of keep a positive outlook because of all the good things it can bring to us. And sort of, speaking of all the good things that it can bring to us, I think that there's a few key things that we can collectively do to thrive in this land of plenty. And I've always hated it when people do this, but I decided I'd try it myself just to see how it would work. Like creating a word out of I don't know, I still don't like it, but we'll take a deft approach to this. No, but like these they just happen to spell a word. So I think that there's like a few key things that we can do to thrive, right? One is diversity, right? And that I think comes in a couple of different forms, right? It comes in the form of, hey, what kind of content do like we as Atomic Fiction want to do? We don't want to get into a series and then do like 8 seasons of that series because all of the artists are going to get bored of it and blah blah blah. Like, so I think we have to like really think hard about how to diversify the kind of content that we're doing to keep the artistic part of this process really alive in people, right? And I think getting stuck in a rut for the sake of making a buck is going to be a real potential pitfall here, because some of these shows, once you create the assets and whatever, they just kind of like they just keep going and it can add to your bottom line, right? And I think that's a real trap to be wary of. And that also is beholden on you guys as artists, for the artists in the room, is to make sure that you're speaking up about the kind of stuff you want to work on. I mean, as you saw in the survey that I took, at Atomic Fiction, we really like to listen to what our artists want to do, and we have like town halls every other week, right? So it's a hey, ask us questions, tell us like what kind of stuff do you want to work on. There's an open line to Mark Sadeghi, who runs sales at the company, that's like, hey, anytime you have a project that you hear about that you want to work on, just send them a note and we'll pursue it, right? I mean, I think that fostering that creativity is really important, and you as artists speaking up in terms of what you want to work on is equally important. There's also the diversity of individuals, and I really, really believe strongly in this. That's racial diversity, diversity of economic background, and gender diversity. Like, at Atomic Fiction, I think the industry average is about 17% female in the industry. We're at around 30% right now, and really trying to bring this up. But also, diversity in the amount of experience that people have at the company, right? So, and the reason why diversity is important is not some government regulation checkbox. I really truly believe that the creative process is really spurred on and accelerated by being around people that are different than you, right? It's like, how boring would it be to be in a room of a bunch of white 40-year-old dudes, right? For me, like, what am I going to get out of that, right? It's just like there's no inspiration in that. And, you know, I think really just sort of accepting and listening to people's backgrounds and different points of view always gives me a real charge in what I do every day. Another thing that's going to be really important, so we talked about diversity, is efficiency. With all this amount of work that's out there, we are going to need to be as efficient as humanly possible in order to be able to actually execute on all this opportunity that's out there. So that's going to become really important from a technology and from a business perspective, right? And so here are just a few bullet points that I threw up here on like what we could do to be more efficient. You know, and there's a gazillion more than what's up here. But you know, it's really like scheduling teams and like how do we manage OT, and you know, I think it's the one other thing that's really important up here, and I'll get back to this in a second, is empowering employees with a sense of ownership. Because I think people that feel a sense of ownership in a process, especially in a world where there's so much content out there to do, it helps people get through even the projects that aren't as creatively exciting if they feel like they're doing it for a cause, right? So you know, this stuff is all mega important, is like really focusing on efficiency. And that goes down to the individual level. Then there's flexibility. Again, this applies in many different ways, right? I think that in order to keep the creative juices of the company flowing, the diversity in content, in order to make a diverse, like, kind of slate of content, you got to be flexible. And I also think that with the amount of work that is out there, there are going to be massive spikes of multiple projects delivering at the same time. So there's going to be flexibility in terms of scale of company and infrastructure that's needed too. And I think that a key part of flexibility is every single person at a company really feeling empowered to contribute to the direction changes and the flex of the company. Now, this is a quote from this amazing book called Work Rules by Laszlo Bock. He heads up, it's not human resources. It's basically their fancy word for human resources at Google, right? So this guy is like Google culture. And he says, student or senior executive being part of an environment where, wait a minute, I totally typoed this. I'm going to actually read it from the book because I read it this morning. And I was like, holy shit, this is like amazing. All right. So student or senior executive being part of an environment where you and those around you will thrive starts with you're taking responsibility for that environment. This is true whether or not it's in your job description and whether or not it's even permitted, right? So this is really just saying, like, take responsibility for how things are in your workplace, right? Never be a victim. And I think that in a world where the amount of content, and this is why I say, like, speak up when it comes to you know, what kind of content you want to work on, right? Things like that, like really driving efficiency at a company, that can't come from top down. It's going to sit at the lowest levels of the pipeline, and it's going to sit in the sales process, and it's going to sit within the culture of the company, right? This is on all of us to take ownership of and really help to drive it to a good place, right? Infrastructure as a utility. Those of you who have heard me talk before know that I'm a massive fan of cloud, mostly because it allows cloud computing allows us to adjust the scale of our infrastructure to match the demands of production, rather than having to like match the production, like when are we rendering what in the schedule to how much infrastructure I have. Otherwise, I'm not going to get my renders done. And oftentimes, when we're interacting, you know, now I'm kind of taking my atomic fiction hat off and putting my conductor hat on, and I'll talk a little bit about conductor in a second. But, you know, we ask companies like, hey, can you share with us what your rendering looks like over the course of, you know, a few days, right? And so usually they'll send us a graph that looks like this, and you can see this sort of plateau that's when our render farm is full, and people will be really proud of a graph that looks like this. It's about 70% utilization here, but what the actual render demands look like when you uncap the size of the render farm is this, right? And when you overlay those two graphs together, you start seeing how badly it actually impacts a company to have a fixed size of infrastructure. This old model, this is like when Phil Tippett was animating those Tauntauns, right? Is building a data center and managing your own render farm. I think it was a necessary evil, but we're heading into a world where, especially with the explosion in content demand out there, that's going to be a thing of the past, right? And this graph shows why, right? Where it's like those plateaus, they just sort of like extend out the time it takes to get things back to artists, right? And it's just bad in a lot of ways. And at the end of this graph, we're not even done rendering. Maybe we missed a deadline, right? So, so I think for creativity, there's so many reasons why cloud is the way of the future for infrastructure in this industry, and a key component to creativity, right? It's like quicker turnaround for artists. You can do things like spend a ton of time up front on assets and things like CFX. I was just working last night on this trailer delivery for this Robert Zemeckis project, and we didn't have all the assets done up until a few days before the trailer deadline. And guess what? Spun up 67,000 processors and got it all done within the course of a couple of days, right? So it's amazing how we can actually work more efficiently and work in a way that's sort of more conducive to a production when we don't have these artificial plateaus of on-premise infrastructure. And then also, just if you do it right, it saves money, right? Over building a local render farm. And the doing it right part is really, really the hard thing. It's insanely complex. So that's why I started another company called Conductor. And really, like Conductor, what we've kind of achieved there is just being able to do enterprise scale rendering. This is not like a hobbyist, like go and sign up for a rendering service and render it. I mean, you could do that as a freelancer, but really this is like meant for studios and companies, enterprise scale. And it makes it like 100 times faster to get into the cloud for companies, saves money. And we have like all kinds of the stuff that I geek out on, like the stuff that Netflix does really well with machine learning and computer vision, all that kind of stuff. I totally geek out on that stuff, and we're applying that to rendering there. And so the result of that, this is actually exactly a graph of Atomic Fiction's last 4 days in rendering, where they would spike up to 66,000 machines, and then Conductor would scale it back down to 0 when it wasn't necessary to have infrastructure anymore, right? So being able to like do this to hit deadlines and to really shape infrastructure to meet the demands in this world of like content just exploding, I think is going to be super important. And it's going to be this kind of flexibility is going to be really important in all kinds of other areas of the workflow. Eventually it'll get into like artist workstations and all that kind of stuff. So this isn't like a Conductor sales pitch, but if you want a Conductor sales pitch, you can go to booth 62, and Mac Moore will be able to give you a big brain dump. He'll be at the Scalar booth. So the last part that I wanted to talk about is truth, right? And I think that being honest in this industry is a very sort of like underrated thing. I think that in the dark ages, we've been so forced to sort of like scramble and kind of like keep things secret as a competitive advantage, and not always able to treat our artists the way that we want to, and it's hard to admit that kind of stuff, right? And now as we kind of get into this land of this golden age, I think that really just sort of like being a little bit more open book and being truthful, not only as companies with the artists that we're working with, but also like Netflix is an example. I'm sure they don't want to use the analytics that they're collecting about the companies that are working for them against them, right? I'm sure that they don't want to sort of take advantage of them. They're really just trying to help, right? They really genuinely are. And so I think that being honest with our clients and being able to like, and just sort of saying no when you need to say no, or saying when something is, hey, we'd rather do this project than this project. These are conversations that in the past have just been totally taboo. And I think that we're kind of entering into a world where we need to not abuse this position that we're going to be in as visual effects companies, where, we'll be in scarce supply again. I think that we need to use it as a way to operate sort of truthfully and honestly and create a healthier ecosystem for all of us. And one thing that kind of personifies this, and this was like a real sort of personal learning experience for me in the last year, was I think this sort of describes how most of Western society works, right? Where we just culturally, and I'm just talking like really big picture culturally, most of us operate this way in a capitalist society where we decide what we want to have, then we figure out what we need to do to get it, and then we assume that we're going to be happy or we're going to be rich or we're going to be something, right? But it starts with like, what do I want to have, right? And I think that sort of in a model where we're all happy and successful together, what we need to do is move to a model, and I do this in my own personal life now, and it's made a big, big difference for me, is move to just subtle shift of words, right? Figure out how I want to be. How do I want to be as a company? What vibe do I want to put forward? How do I want to be as an individual? How do I want to show up in the world? And that naturally informs what I do. And then we have the thing that's right. And I think that this is particularly useful. This shift in mindset from have do be to be do have is particularly useful in a world where a lot of shit is changing, right? Because we don't even know what the have is going to be. The landscape is going to change so dramatically over the course of the next 3 to 4 years. For a lot of reasons, technologically and also demand-wise, it's going to change so dramatically that if we decide what we want to have today, it's probably going to be wrong a few years down the line, right? The landscape is changing that fast. Whereas if we approach things from how do I want to be? How do I want to be as an artist? How do I want to be as a company? And just sort of let that inform what we do, I think we're going to have an amazing thing as an industry in general. So, it wouldn't be an opening keynote if I didn't pimp some different presentations. These are kind of my picks of like what would be super interesting. There's also this is what I would go see, right? Yeah, so I think there's so much exciting content that's being presented at this conference, and these are just my personal things, but somebody else might be completely different. But I think that there's like all this stuff is going to be so amazing at this conference, and we'll learn a lot. And I'll definitely pimp Stranger Things 2 tomorrow afternoon with Seth Hill, and then also in the morning at 10:30 there is a predictive analytics and cloud computing thing that Mac Moore is putting on that I think is going to be really, really interesting about like how we can use technology forward thinking to help our workflows actually improve using cloud. So lots of really interesting stuff here. And lastly, I want to thank you guys and invite you to visit the Atomic Fiction booth, which is booth 61 in the corner. Yeah, I'd love to tell you more about what we're doing. And, if there's any of you that are interested in joining forces, we're hiring, surprise. So thank you so much for everybody for coming and enjoy the conference. Do we do QA? Do we have QA time? I know we're kind of 10 minutes over.
5 minutes.
5 minutes of Q&A.
5 minutes.
Does anybody have questions?
Everybody wants a coffee.
Everybody wants a coffee. You have a question? Yeah, go for it.
Stand up, please.
If you get a new project that requires some training or your team is not necessarily formed for it, how do you plan on like your learning for those
Yeah.
who ask them right away to do it? Or just how do you determine the time you give to learn and to test and to
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So the question was like, how, when we get something that's sort of new that a team isn't really attuned to, like how do we approach that? How much time do we give that process of learning? Sometimes the answer is none. And there is just like, hey, we need to start this tomorrow and it's, whatever. But in an ideal world, I think that there's two really great ways of learning. One is sort of training program, but I think that's more for the basics. What we're much more of a fan of is pairing people with mentors that people can learn from sort of in production, right? And it's like learning a language, right? You can study Chinese and you can use Duolingo or whatever, or you can just immerse yourself in Chinese and you're going to learn that much faster, right? So the way Atomic Fiction is set up is that we have departments, and each department has a supervisor and a manager, and that manager's job and the supervisor's job is to make sure that they're recognizing when somebody needs mentorship and can actually get that on the job. And that, for me, I believe that it's kind of a high pressure way of learning, but it's also so gratifying when you see the result of what you've done up there on the screen.
Another question?
We need at least one more. There you go. All right.
You mentioned how you can use like cloud infrastructure to scale when you have lots of data at work. But how do you scale things? How do you work with resources that don't scale as well, like personnel, when you don't have that much?
Yeah. So the question was like, it's easy to scale, like with something like Conductor. It's easy to scale infrastructure in the cloud. And Conductor, by the way, is backed by Google, right? So they have more compute power than the world. But with people, like, how do we deal with that, right? And I think it's a really good question. This industry is famous for, hiring and firing, right? And that's kind of been a reality of the sort of the spikiness of the workload that we've had to deal with up until recently. Atomic Fiction hasn't really like shrank in quite a while. It's been mostly growing. And I think that in this sort of golden age, it's going to be important for companies to sort of like decide how big do they want to be, and then kind of just cap it at that, and then foster people's careers within there. Because there's always, in this new world, there's always going to be the opportunity to grow, right? And that cap might be 2,000 people, right? But it's like there's got to be sort of a business appetite and a personnel appetite that align. And then I think the need to sort of vary infrastructure really is going to happen hour by hour or week by week as sort of, one project's getting started and you're in like keyframes for lighting rather than final lighting, right? So to me, as a owner of a visual effects company, one of the most expensive things we do is hire new people, right? Because finding them is hard, interviewing them is hard, bringing them on board and training them until the point where they're effective in the production is hard. It's really expensive. So I think it would be way, way better for every company out there is if they can find ways to bring people on board and just keep them, assuming that they're performing, right? And find ways to sort of inspire growth in those people, right? So that's sort of from a business perspective what we need to do. And I think that this new explosion of content, as long as we don't just go way too far, right, with like, hey, we're just going to grow until somebody says we have no more work for you. As long as people don't do that, we'll be in actually a pretty good place to be able to stabilize the workforce a bit better, I think.
Okay.
Great. Enjoy the conference.